Across the world, there are about 1.5 billion people that are affected by conflict and fragility, and the world's poor are increasingly concentrated in fragile states. And about 30% of total annual official development assistance goes to countries that are fragile or conflict affected. These facts, the international community collectively, including us, faces a big challenge in terms of trying to break this cycle. And one thing also that we know from experience is that poorly designed and badly coordinated efforts in these types of situations can often do more harm than good. There are also a number of studies that demonstrate, not surprisingly, that political instability undermines economic growth. An Asia 2050 report, which was published a couple of years ago by ADB, recognizes that conflict and fragility can jeopardize the region's growth and development prospects. And while conflict itself is devastating for individual countries or individual regions within these countries, it can also have a drag in a sub-region more broadly. And while Asia as whole's economic development hasn't been derailed by those countries within the region that have suffered from conflict or fragility, it is a very good reminder that this kind of violence and this kind of lack of stability can't be taken for granted. And while Asia has performed, as we all know, quite well, there is always on the horizon these risks of these conflicts that can very much undermine the future prospects of the region or sub-regions within the region more broadly. And I think we don't need to look very far back in history. We look today at GMS as a great example of economic success, but it's not too long ago that GMS was a region that was mired in conflict and mired in really a lack of growth and a lack of performance in human development indicators and a whole range of different things. And that was a result of conflict and issues that were very, very common, again, very much within all of our lifetimes and within many of our professional lifetimes. So I think that one thing that we have to be aware of in dealing with these types of situations, of course, is the fact that much like when we're dealing with any individual country, whether it be conflict afflicted or not, we really need to tailor our interventions and tailor our approaches to the specific needs of the country. And the IED's assessment of ADB's support to conflict and fragile states concluded that our 2007 approach to weakly performing countries is relevant, and it was a relatively positive assessment of that, but a more differentiated approach to engagement is necessary. And so I think that in these difficult situations, we often tend to deal only with the direct consequences of conflict and fragility, such as the decline of social services, but not the drivers of conflict and fragility, which are often linked to socio-political dynamics in the country. These types of situations, a much better understanding of politics, of culture, of socio-economic issues is critically important, which will enable us to identify specific entry points for promoting inclusive and stable political and economic environments. Because again, anything that we do in these environments, if we don't take these factors into account, is not going to produce the results that it might otherwise do. So when you're looking at a stable country, when you're looking at a country that has well-developed political regimes, we have to understand what those are, but it's unlikely that the political situation in a country is going to have a huge impact on the economic returns of an investment that we make in a very stable economic or political environment. Whereas in a country that's fragile, you can't take that for granted, because politically, socially, culturally, things can happen that will either stop our ability to continue with this infrastructure project, or will result in it being destroyed in very short order, or any of these other things. So again, it's very critical that we have that understanding. Fragility, as we all know, is very costly for a country and its citizens, but it's also costly for its neighboring countries and to the global community. And if we don't heed the lessons that are, I think, well presented in this handbook, we are going to end up having to go and do the same things over and over and over again in these countries, rather than doing it right once. This is very important. And we also need, of course, to think very, very carefully about the kinds of interventions we do. As I said, think very carefully of the political, social issues, cultural issues in these environments in a way that we don't necessarily have to think about them in other environments.